Hi, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. A couple of years back, I did a video on my first use of the x100s, the Fujifilm x100s, during my first trip to Paris. And during that video, I talked about, sort of a kind of review of the camera while practically using it for travel photography. And so I just recently came back from a trip and I used that same camera for this trip. And I wanted to talk about the camera, now 3-4 years on, as well as talk about some of the principles that I talk about on these videos about seeing and capturing images. So I'm going to share a couple of the images that I made there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my choice as to why I didn't upgrade to either the latest iteration of the camera, which currently is the X100F, or transition into another camera that was being recommended to me, either a Sony or a Leica or whatever. So I'm going to start showing you the photographs and sort of give you my thought process for why I approached the trip in the way that I did. Now, when I went on this trip, I had been thinking about whether or not I should upgrade to the newest iteration of this camera, the X100F, or use a Sony camera that was being recommended to me, or a Leica camera that was being suggested to me. And though that was tempting, because I like the idea that the promise of the latest technology would help me make better photographs, I knew that there would be a learning curve, that even with upgrading to the F, there were going to be certain things about that camera that worked differently from the camera that I've been using for the last several years. And that as a result of having to become familiar with that camera, sometimes I would be too preoccupied with the camera itself, and that it might hamper my ability to be able to get the shot when I needed to get the shot. The limitations of the X100S I'm very familiar with, because I've been using that camera every day for the last 3 or 4 years. So the fact that, the EV screen takes a little bit of time to sort of wake up, and then I have to keep tapping the shutter release button in order to keep it ready for a moment that may happen as I'm walking down the street, or the fact that the autofocus isn't as fast when a subject is about 3 feet or closer to me, are issues that I'm very familiar with, and I know that there are workarounds for me to be able to get past those things and still be able to get my shots. I wish that I had a camera that I absolutely didn't have anything to worry about, but in my many years of making photographs, every camera has its issues, and you always have to find some sort of workaround for it. And the latest generations of cameras may have resolved all of the issues that I currently have with the S. But again, I really just did not have the luxury of time to figure out not only whether or not that was true or not, but getting as familiar with the camera as I am with the S currently. So for me, I really wanted to just focus on making photographs. And this image is a shot that I made I think within the first day or two that I had arrived in Paris. This was made at 1/1700th of a second at f4 ISO 400, and we were walking by the Seine, and I looked over the walkway that overlooks this area, and I saw these umbrellas that were lining this lawn area there, and I really loved the graphic nature of the umbrellas. And in between the umbrellas, there were these lawn chairs with different people sort of laying down and drinking wine or eating lunch. And I knew that I wanted to use those umbrellas to sort of bookend whatever I was going to frame in the center. So I found a spot where I found these two people here in the lawn chairs, taking in lunch. And I just turned the camera over and I just started carefully trying to frame it. And I love the graphic lines of the umbrellas. I love the triangles that are created by the just shape and the design of the umbrellas. And as you've heard me talk about in videos, triangles are really something that I'm always looking for, especially the repetition of triangles to help complete the shot. And as I was framing this shot, I knew immediately that this space here at the top was largely going to be an area of negative space, and that I would need something in order to sort of complete the shot. So I framed my shot here, and the wall that I was standing atop was right here. So I couldn't bring the camera down any further because then the wall was going to be inside of the frame. So this is about as far as I could tilt the camera without including the wall in the frame. But it allowed me to sort of include just enough here of the walkway. And as people passed by, I made several shots until I got this fellow here at the very peak of the frame, and it creates this nice implied triangle of these three human figures. And we also get the splay of the legs, which is another triangle, which helps to help complete the shot. Now for me, as you've probably have heard me talk about in other videos, I usually preset my camera well ahead of time before encountering a scene. I'm not looking at a scene and then all of a sudden trying to figure what my settings are. I usually always go out with my camera set for an aperture f4 or 5.6. I have my ISO set for auto. My white balance is set for auto, even though I know I usually convert my images over to black and white. And so I don't really have to think about what my camera settings are. During the initial days in Paris, it was a lot of overcast. So I knew that I would need to usually use an aperture about f4 or 5.6 in order to maintain a reasonable shutter speed, especially when I got into areas of relatively deep shade. And I didn't want to worry about getting pictures that were soft due to camera shake. So a lot of my decisions with respect to camera settings were made well before I encountered anything that I wanted to photograph. I would just take a look at what the quality of the light was, and I would set my camera, and then I would start making pictures. And then if I wanted a wider aperture or a smaller aperture, I would adjust that on the fly. But for this, I immediately looked down at the scene, and I just immediately started making the photographs. I knew that the aperture of f4 with the depth of field that's already provided by the 23mm lens, which in this case is acting as the equivalent of a 35mm lens, would provide me enough depth of field because of the way I was shooting the scene. So for me, this is a shot that I'm really pleased with, but it was a shot where I didn't have to think at all about how the camera was going to handle the scene. I was already familiar with it. I didn't have to deal with any of sort of the quibbles that I sometimes have with the camera in terms of focus speed or any other stuff. It was pretty straightforward. And, you know, this is one of the things that I was talking about earlier in terms of being able to focus almost all of my attention on just seeing. I didn't want the camera standing in my way of a photograph. And I knew if I took a brand new camera on a trip, almost inevitably, I would struggle with that issue. Here's another shot that I made in Saint-Germain, in the Latin Quarter. It was made at 1250th of a second, f2.8, ISO 800. This image was made during a ceremony on the day that was to celebrate the Ascension of the Virgin Mary. So there was this religious ceremony and this procession up to a place where they have a statue of the Virgin Mary. And they had priests and nuns and a variety of different people sort of celebrating. And these people here were praying. And I just was walking around making different photographs and just taking advantage of the fact that people were so immersed in what they were doing in terms of the ceremony that I could actually get greater access to photographing people relatively close than I normally would just walking down the street. So if you follow my Instagram, you'll see a variety of different images from the trip beyond what I'm showing you here in this video. And I came upon this shot and immediately I gravitated to the hands. The hands and the way that they were clenched were the visual draw for me. And I made this initial shot. And I made another shot where I turned the camera vertically and I focused more on the feet and the hands. But when I was reviewing the photographs later, I realized that including the feet in the frame, the feet of the other people in the frame, really helped to create a nice counterpoint to the clenched hands. There's the repetition of the feet that happens with the four figures that are in the frame, but the hands themselves are a contrast to that. It also helps that the hands are one of the brighter elements in the frame, and the gesture itself is so dramatic, and the contrast that's created by the pale hands against the dark suit all help to create this wonderful visual draw. And again, I didn't have to really think about what I wanted to do with the camera, other than the fact that I knew that I wanted to have a shallower depth of field. So I typically was starting off at maybe an aperture f4 5.6, and in this case all I needed to do was just change my aperture to 2.8, because I knew that all that really cared about was the hands. So I wanted those to be pretty sharp and then allow everything else to kind of fall out of focus. And even though the other elements are not blurred dramatically, it's not like I'm using a 1.8 aperture, you get enough detail there for it to be rendered pretty appealingly for me. Now this image speaks to the idea that I talk about a lot in terms of just owning the frame. Because when I was composing the shot, yeah, I was drawn to the hands, and I like the feet, and I like the fact that he was kneeling on the curb, but it was what else is in the frame. And I talk about this over and over again in a lot of these videos and in my workshops. It's like, what else is in the frame? Why are you including it, or why are you excluding it? By including the other figures in the frame, it provides a context. It gives a sense of something that's happening as a group. You may not necessarily know that this was about the ceremony that was being performed. You don't know exactly what the religious ceremony is, but you know that there's something going on that probably has some sort of religious connotation, because how everyone is sort of kneeling there. At least the three figures are kneeling, and this other woman is sort of standing in the frame. But it was the idea that, yeah, the hands were what drew me, but by including all these other elements in the frame, I include elements that help to complement the composition and make it much more effective than it would have been had I just gone in and just isolated the hands themselves. I mean, getting a nice tight shot of the hands would have been a really good shot, but I was working with the 23mm, the 35mm of the camera. So I literally would have to be inches from his hands in order to be able to make the shot. And even then, I probably would not have been able to eliminate those elements just outside of the edges of his suit to the left and to the right. And for me, I just didn't want to make that kind of shot. I think that this shot works for all the reasons that I just gave you. But again, it was the technical stuff with respect to the camera was a simple one. Just switch the aperture of 2.8 and go in and make the shot. And I was able to completely focus on not only what was happening in the center of the frame, but what was happening at the edges of the frame as well. Okay, here's another shot. This was made at 140th of a second at 5.6, ISO 200. So I had just turned a corner. My camera was already preset for an aperture of 5.6. And I saw this girl who was chewing on her sunglasses, and I immediately knew that this was a worthy shot. And as I started moving closer to her in order to make the shot, I took my attention off of her and I started paying attention to everything else in the frame. I like this shot because it's layered, because of the other characters that are in the frame. You have the boy on the left-hand side. You have the two people who I assume are the parents. We have the person window shopping. We have the guy in the background in the sweat top and the hat. And all of these figures sort of play off of each other. The anchor of the shot is certainly the little girl, but it's the interplay of all these different figures that I think makes this an interesting shot. And this is the kind of shot I'm actively pursuing. I'm kind of trying to avoid taking pictures where the camera is parallel to a wall and I wait for someone to walk in front of it and make my shot. I mean, we see that endlessly in a lot of street photographs, and I certainly make my share of those kinds of images. But I'm trying to do something a little more complicated. I'm trying to do something a little more challenging, which is creating images with depth, which often call for me to be shooting down a street and being very conscious of the different people that are in the street along with what I believe is going to be my main subject. And it's really hit and miss because it's so chaotic and random in terms of where people are standing that you really have no control over it. And sometimes it's just luck, or a combination of luck and then me being prepared enough to make whatever micro changes I need to make in terms of shifting my camera position to the left or to the right or up or down or moving closer or moving further back in order to effectively get the shot. And this is what was happening for me here, because as I started moving towards the girl, I was making these slight changes in my position to try to get as much separation between all the figures before everything changed. And so this was about as close as I could get to it and make the shot. And I think that even though I would have liked to have a little separation between the guy in black and the woman, I'm still pretty pleased with the shot because of how all these characters sort of play off of each other. And I like the body language and the gestures that each exhibits, especially the girl, but also the boy and the woman who has her hand to her face as if she's completely exhausted, the man on the phone. I think they play off of each other really, really well. I don't see anything in this frame and I feel like, oh, that's really an element I would want to get rid of. Even the woman in the far left-hand corner of the frame whose body is cut in half, at first I considered cropping her out, but then I felt like it added a little bit of balance over to the composition. So I just sort of kept it in there rather than sort of cropping her out entirely. This shot works, but one of the reasons why I was able to get this shot is, again, I wasn't concerned with settings. I had already set my camera to aperture of 5.6. I had an ISO with 200. If I had thought a little more beforehand, this is again an overcast day, I might have increased my aperture to 800 in order to avoid a shutter speed as low as 1/40th of a second. 1/25th of a second is bare minimum for me. Ideally, I'd be shooting at 250th of a second or faster, just to counter the motion of the subjects or my own body or my own hands bringing the camera to my eye and introducing camera shake. So on an overcast day, I usually increase my ISO to 800. In this case, for whatever reason, I didn't. I think I was allowing the camera's auto ISO to handle everything. But even with that relatively slow shutter speed of 1/140th of a second, I was able to get a nicely sharp image and get everything acceptably sharp. And more importantly, I was able to focus my complete attention on my composition and paying attention to those small little details. Because if for whatever reason the camera was hiccuping, or I was having to change something on the fly on the camera at the last minute, this scene would have changed enough where I would have completely lost it. And it's one of the reasons why I think it's really important to get as familiar and comfortable with your camera as possible. One of the things that happened during this trip is that I wasn't shooting as aggressively as I have in the past. Usually on vacations with my wife, I would take about like a half a day or a day and just say, honey, on this day, I'm just going to be shooting. We're not going to do this tourism thing. I'm just going to go out and just dedicate it to my photography. And this trip, I didn't do any of that. I just spent all of my time with her, and I just grabbed my shots as they presented themselves. And one of the interesting things about that is that I felt a lot less pressure on myself to make great photographs on this trip. Usually I'm always about trying to produce as many great photographs each day as possible. And the only bar I set for myself is that at the end of each day, I want to feel like I made a photograph that I was very pleased with. It didn't necessarily have to be a great shot. It didn't necessarily have to be the best shot I'd ever made. It just had to be a shot where I felt like I challenged myself, I met the challenge, and I produced a really good photograph. That was it. And as a result of that, I found myself really being more of a casual observer of what was happening around me. I always had the camera in my hand, and I always tried to be as ready for any of the opportunities that presented themselves. But I found that change in mindset was really freeing for me. It was kind of like what I experienced when I first started using a camera phone, where it was just about making photographs for the pleasure of making photographs. And what that was made it really conducive for me was just this trip and my use of the camera being another opportunity to just practice seeing. It was less about making killer photographs as can I practice my seeing to the point that I can recognize something in a split second, recognize the potential of it for a photograph, and control this camera well enough to be able to pull off the shot. So, we were here, I think I was drinking coffee, waiting for the restaurant that we were going to open up. And I saw this light coming and hitting this doorway. And immediately I just knew that if I got something interesting coming in and out that door, it would be great. And mostly it was the waiters coming in and out of the door. So I just positioned my camera and I just basically started refining my frame. I saw the umbrellas, I saw the cafe, the words of the cafe, I saw this figure here on his phone, I saw the street scene, I saw the dark tones of the door and the wall, and all of those things I started considering in terms of what my composition was going to look like when someone finally came into the scene to help complete it. And so I observed as different waiters and different people walked in and out of the door, slowly refining my composition. And once I had sort of settled on that, when this waiter came and stopped, I knew I had my shot. So as soon as he stepped there and stopped, I just took, I think, probably 2 frames, if that, and I had my shot. I just love how the light falls on him. I like the tone of his vest, his pants, his shirt, and how it contrasts with the dark tones of everything around him, how it complements the tone of the dark jacket of the guy that's seated. Graphically, this is a really interesting shot. It's kind of busy in terms of the lines and the shapes that pervade the entire frame, but because of the interplay between light and dark, it really works. And all these images were made in color, but for almost all the shots that I ended up posting on my Instagram, they just worked a lot better as black and whites. I found that in many of the shots, the colors themselves were distracting unless they were shot at night, in which color became much more important. For me, a lot of the shots that I'm sharing today and that I posted on Instagram, they just work better as black and white. And this scene is a perfect example of that. We were walking back to the hotel, and all of a sudden there were these birds that started flying overhead. And at first I didn't make a shot. It was like they initially came and I looked up, but then they just kept coming. And I was like, wow, this is sort of an endless stream of birds. And then I realized, oh, this is a great opportunity to make photographs. So I immediately raised the camera to my eye and I started making shots. But as I was making shots, I became aware of the buildings that were on either side of me. And I realized that while the birds themselves were very interesting, the buildings themselves were going to add a really important graphic to this shot. You can see the V here, right? You can see the V that's created by the position of this building. The triangle is created by the angle created here. And that is repeated by, the sort of the shapes, the triangular shapes created by the birds themselves. And I just started making shots. And again, my camera was already preset. As you can see, this was an overcast day. I had my aperture set to f4 in order to maintain a reasonably fast shutter speed. And all I needed to do at this point was to lock the focus on the building on the right-hand side, because I knew that because I had my focus point typically set for the center focus point on the camera, that I might not get a sharp shot if it were trying to focus on the clouds, and that the camera's autofocus system would just rack back and forth. So that was one of the things that being aware about the limitation of the camera was really important, that I focused on the building, locked the focus, and then from then I just kept making shots. And the relationship of the birds to each other was constantly changing with each frame. But I just kept making shots because they just kept coming. And so later on, when I looked and compared all the different shots, this is the one that worked the best for me. There's a slight S curve that's created here, which, as you know, if you pay attention to anything with respect to compositional tools, using an S curve is always a great way of being able to create a fairly pleasing composition, and that's created here by the placement of the birds here. But I like that many of the birds here are all providing slightly different shapes, different sizes within the frame. This bird here that's in the lead is just really beautifully defined in here, and I think the presence of this bird here really helps to make the shot, and all these others complement it really, really nicely. As a result of exposing for the sky, this scene here was underexposed. I accentuated the contrast a little in post, and I brought up the sky a little by applying some selective dodging and burning, and also some selective contrast, which I do to all of my pictures, but it's not too extensive. But again, this is a scene that all of a sudden was happening, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. I didn't have to change any of my settings. All I needed to do was focus on the building, lock focus, and just start shooting. And I didn't have it in burst mode. I always work in single servo mode. So I wasn't firing the camera, and just holding down the shutter release button and depressing it and just firing one after another. I was actually just kept pressing the shutter release button. Had I taken the time to change the drive mode, I likely would have missed out on this shot. So, all right, here we have a shot that was made at 1/800th of a second at f4 ISO 400. So, like I said before, there are a lot of opportunities that I would have to sit at a cafe making shots of people walking by. And this was towards the tail end of the trip, and I had kind of gotten burnt out on making those kinds of shots because they weren't particularly interesting. One of the challenges in this particular scene was that there was so much foot traffic and so many cars moving past on the street that there was just too many distractions, that whatever composition I would come up with just didn't work. And I know I was tempted to just start getting up and just start making shots, but I was like, let me see if I can make a shot, even though I'm just seated here at this table. And I thought, how can I make these compositions differently? And I looked, and I saw the items that were on the table: the water bottle, the glass, the salt shaker. And I thought, well, what happens if I can bring the camera down? And I turned on the LCD of the camera, and I was looking through that rather than the viewfinder. And I saw that I could eliminate a lot of distractions by sandwiching whatever was walking in front of me between the bottle and the glass. And one of the things I was contending with was that as people walk by, I wasn't just dealing with singular people. I was often dealing with groups of people. And even though I might have an interesting character in the center of the frame, there would be someone in front or behind, and it just ruined the composition. It just didn't work. It wasn't balanced, or it just didn't work for whatever reason. But by bringing the camera down to this unusual position, I realized, wow, if I can get the right person in the center of the frame, I can maybe come up with an interesting shot. So that's what I just started to do. Again, you can see here I'm using that f4 aperture. I didn't change any of the settings. I knew that the f4, and because the f4 would give me a shallow depth field, and because the proximity of the lens to the items on the desk, that those foreground elements were going to be thrown out of focus, and that the area in the background would be sharp enough to give you a context in terms of providing a sense of place. And so I just started shooting. Now, one of the issues I thought I might have was just the speed of the focus, because as you can see here, I would see people, and usually they would be behind the glass when I would see them, and I would have to decide exactly when I was going to depress the shutter release button, and at which point the camera would have to detect focus, get it, and make the shot. So there was going to be a slight delay there. And I know I could have preset the focus for the spot where I anticipated people were going to walk, but I was really curious. Can I rely on the autofocus of this camera, even though it's 2 generations old? Can it respond fast enough in order for me to get the shot? And because of the distance that I was shooting from, I was pretty sure that the camera would be able to do it, and it did. Had the subject been even closer, like 3 feet or closer, This camera is just not fast enough for whatever reason to detect focus when the subject is 3 feet or closer. It just takes too long, and I miss too many shots as a result. So when I know I'm going to be shooting 3 feet or closer to a subject, I will often just manually preset the focus and shoot that way. But in this case, it worked. Now again, because I wasn't preoccupied with the camera, I was able to start really thinking about how to shoot this thing differently. And that was really important for the success of that shot. And it also helps that I'm critiquing a lot of other people's photographs, and I get to see the choices that they make in terms of the composition, because I see so many examples of people doing things that don't immediately come to mind for me when I'm making my photographs. They do something and I go, wow, I have to remember that. I need to remember to get below eye level, or turn the camera vertically, or get physically closer, or try to include this or that element within the frame. This shot is a direct inspiration of what I've been seeing and critiquing all these different photographs. And the result, I think, is one of the better shots that I made on the trip. This is a fellow here that my wife really encouraged me to photograph. I think this was on the last day or the second to last day that we were there, and we were having breakfast and we saw this guy. And usually I have no hesitation about approaching people and asking to make their photographs, but I feel a little awkward because I don't speak a lick of French. And usually I use language in order to sort of approach people and explain who I am and what I'm doing. And even though I saw this guy and wanted to make his photograph, I was a little bit intimidated, but my wife kept bugging me to make the photograph. So when he was passing by us again, we were both looking at him, and he looked at us and we smiled, and he smiled back, and then I raised my camera. I said, "Hey, can I make your photograph?" And he just waved me over, and I immediately moved towards him and started to make a shot. My initial shot had him in the reverse position, so he was facing where his back is right now, and almost immediately I knew that the light wasn't going to work. A lot of his face was relegated to shadow, and I made the initial frame, and I immediately motioned for him to turn around so that I could get better light. And if you look at his sunglasses, you can see that there's a tall building that is reflecting sunlight, which is bouncing into his face, creating this really nice, even, soft light. I shot this at 1250th of a second at f2.8 ISO 800. So, in terms of the technical stuff with the camera, one of the things I chose to do was go with a wider aperture, 2.8. And one of the reasons was that I wanted to keep the elements in the background out of focus. I didn't want to go with a 5.6 in order to get everything tack sharp, as I typically do when it comes to making portraits. I usually go with a smaller aperture. But here, there were some distracting elements in the background which I didn't want to be concerned with at all. So I knew that by going to a 2.8 aperture, I would be able to get most of his face acceptably sharp, and a lot of the other elements would be out of focus. You can see from his jacket how shallow the depth of field is here, but how much of his beard, his eyes, even the cigarette is really sharp. And I really like the result that I get from using and choosing that shallow depth of field. But again, because I knew my camera and I already knew what my starting point was for my settings, all I needed to do was change my aperture. Now, one of the other things that I needed to change was the autofocus point, because I usually work with a single autofocus point at the center. So the other thing that I knew I needed to change was I needed to change the position of the autofocus point so that it was targeting his eyes, or in this case, the sunglasses. So as I was rotating him into position, that was the other change that I was making. So I was already conscious of that as I was about to make the shots leading up to this frame, and I didn't have to think about it. So those were just two changes that I needed to make. I needed to change my aperture, and then I needed to change my focus point. And after that, I didn't have to concern myself at all with anything with respect to the camera. And then I was able to make 5 or 7 shots, of which this is the best. I really like how the smoke just comes out of his mouth, which I didn't even see when I was making the shot. I only caught that after the fact when I was looking through the images in Lightroom, and I went, oh wow, the smoke coming out of his mouth really makes the photograph. But I was really conscious of all that stuff in the edges of the frame. You see those black bars that sort of sandwich this piece of glass on which the menus for the day were written. We have bikes in the background. But I just didn't want all that stuff to be in the frame. And it's one of the reasons why I moved in so tight with him. Because even though I'm dealing with the equivalent of a 35 millimeter lens, which you typically don't want to use for portraits, that's all I have. I don't have any of these adapter lenses that convert the lens on the camera to a 50 millimeter. I'm dealing with the equivalent of a 35 millimeter. And I knew that in order to minimize the distractions, I would have to move in tight. But the distortion that's created really doesn't ruin the shot for me. I think it accentuates the detail of the beard really, really nicely. I like the way the hat frames his face. I love the reflection in the eyes. I love the gesture of the cigarette coming out of his mouth. All of it comes together really, really beautifully. I'm really happy with this frame, and I'm glad my wife encouraged me to make the photograph. So that's it in terms of the shots and what my experience was. My biggest takeaway about it, and I hope it's helpful to you, is this idea that the next time you go on a trip or an excursion, don't feel it absolutely necessary to have to upgrade to the latest camera in order to make the best shots. The only way I would recommend that is if you have enough time to practice with the camera to the point that you feel like you're comfortable with it. That in terms of making adjustments for focus, white balance, exposure compensation, all of those things, that you can make them almost with your eyes closed. That's how comfortable I need to be with the camera in order to ensure that I'm getting the best shot possible. Because I think that if you are, whether you're using a DSLR, whether you're using a medium format, whether you're using your iPhone, whatever it is, being completely comfortable with your gear is really important to getting to the point that you are free to see, to react, and to make the kinds of shots that you really aspire to make. I really had fun on this trip. Even though I didn't make as many shots as I've made in previous trips, I think I came away with some of the better photographs that I've made traveling to Paris. This was my third time, and I think a lot of these were better, largely as a result of just the fact that I've been so focused on seeing and composition over the last couple of years and less about the technical side, that I was able to bring all those things to the fore, to the point that I was able to make much more effective photographs, even though my frame count on each day wasn't in the hundreds. There usually was less than 100 frames each day, and yet I was still each day able to come up with pictures that I was very, very satisfied with. And the images that I'm sharing with you here, I'm really happy to share them. I'm not embarrassed at all about any of these shots. I think these shots are really representative of how I'm seeing right now. And more importantly, I had fun and I had a good time. And I think that whether you're traveling on vacation, whether you're just going on a weekend outing to make photographs, it's really important to have fun. And for me, I'm having the most fun is when I'm dedicating 95 to 100% to the practice and the act of seeing. That for me is the joy of photography. Seeing something in the midst of all this chaos, recognizing the potential of it, and making a photograph. It has nothing to do with the camera that I was holding in my hands. Yes, I need that camera in order to make the shot, in order to capture the image and have it respond in the way that I need to. It's an invaluable and indispensable part of making photographs. But for me, the joy comes from seeing, not the camera that I was using. And I hope that this video and everything that I've shared with you is really, really helpful. If you're going to be in the Los Angeles area next weekend, September 16th, 2017, join me for a 2-day photographic workshop to the Los Angeles Center of Photography. There, you're going to be working with me for 2 days on my approach to street photography. I'll be sharing it with you while we shoot in Hollywood and downtown Los Angeles, and I'll be able to provide you the kind of critique sessions that we offer here on the YouTube channel, but I'll be there to sort of walk you through my entire process from making images, from dealing with camera settings, from eyeing a scene and being able to be sort of prescient in terms of anticipating a moment right before it happens to be ready for it. It's going to be fun. It's going to be intense. But if you want to improve your street photography and take it to new levels, consider joining me. And the Candid Frame is more than a YouTube channel. It's also a podcast in which I feature conversations with photographers. And though we stream the audio here on the YouTube channel, it's also available through the Candid Frame app, which is available for free. And if you go to the website, you'll be able to download the app for whatever operating system you use on your smart device, and you get access to all the hundreds of interviews that we've offered there. We're on episode 385, and our most recent interview was with Jennifer Yofi Schwartz, who was a photographer, a curator, a gallery owner, and now she is doing book publishing, catering to photographers. It's a great conversation, especially about a woman who sort of has taken on a variety of different challenges in her career, and has just proven that there's not just one way to lead a photographic life. And it's a really fun conversation, and I think you'll enjoy it. And typically on this YouTube channel, I offer critiques of photographs that are submitted to the Candid Frame Flickr pool. And to join that, all you need to do is go on your computer, do a search on the Candid Frame, and just ask to be added. And I'll be glad to add you. Try to avoid trying to add yourself to the group on your tablet or your phone. For whatever reason, you'll get a notification that this is a private group or something like that, and that you can't join. I don't know why it doesn't work when you try it on your tablet or your phone. Just go on your computer, go to Flickr, ask to be added, and I'll be more than glad to do it. I usually get to it once a week, so if you don't see me approve you immediately, it's just because I just haven't gotten to it. And but I will, and I will add you. And you can contribute some great photographs like so many other people have done over the past year. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.